Hello again, and welcome to another edition of the new Character Matters. I'm Dr. George Simon, and today we're going to be discussing once again narcissism in all of its many forms and how it affects relationships. And we're going to begin a discussion of the more seriously malignant forms of narcissism. That's a term that's gained some prominence in the literature and online articles and is being talked about in many circles these days. But we're going to be talking about just what malignancy and narcissism is all about. We, in a prior program, talked about the more benign kinds of narcissistic uh, personalities there can be. But we're now going to begin discussing the more malignant narcissistic types and how this malignancy affects relationships in a really traumatic way. There's a lot more malignant narcissism these days, and for a variety of reasons that we will eventually discuss. But today we're going to talk about just what makes narcissism malignant as opposed to relatively more benign. Last program, I talked about some of the charmers who are gifted at the art of ego massage. They're uh, sometimes relatively benign. They are needy attention and adulation seekers who are willing to trade some uh, adulation of you, some what appears to be positive regard of you. They're willing to flatter you. Um, Knowing full well that you'll likely return the favor and hoping, of course, that you do. And most of these charmers are of the less malignant type of narcissist. They just want to be loved. They're not really sincere lovers. They can come across that way. They're more sincere love seekers. And what they're not really seeking so much is true love, but rather affirmation, attention, adulation. They want you to heap some praise on them, uh, think well of them, make them feel special. And they are willing to do whatever they have to do to get you to do that. Most especially, they're willing to adulate you, praise you, charm you, in order for you to return the favor. Some charmers have much more nefarious motives. Some folks look to work to worm their way into your heart for the purpose of eventually exploiting you, taking severe advantage of you. What makes the difference with all the more malignant kinds of narcissists are primarily two factors. Two things really factor into malignant narcissism, and the degree to which these two factors are present determines the degree to which someone is malignantly narcissistic. So the pathology is all about the severity of these two factors when they're present. One factor is an empathy deficiency. There are some folks that either lack the ability to care, as most of us humans can care, or they don't care for a variety of reasons, some of which we'll discuss on today's program. The other factor has to do with a pathological sense of self, an inflated sense of self-worth, a grandiosity that is not rooted in unconscious insecurity or feelings of low self-esteem. Rather, it's born of a sense of entitlement, uh, of special status that is held as a sincere conviction. There are some folks who really do believe sincerely, whether there's any practical justification for it or not. They sincerely believe they're great, they're special, they're more important, and they're inherently superior to you. And when those two factors combine, we have a very malignant form of narcissism. But when either of these two factors are present to any degree, we have some degree of malignancy in narcissism, the kind of malignancy that inevitably leads to trauma in relationships. Those folks at the severe end of the spectrum, those folks who have drastically impaired ability to care, they simply don't care, can't care, and who consider themselves so superior that they feel entitled to prey, Prey, upon others. They wantonly use and abuse people without compunction. And we'll be talking about why that is and how bad that can get in some future programs. But on today's program, on this program, we're going to be talking about these two factors and the spectrum of severity that both this grandiose sense of self and this impaired ability to care factor into narcissism that's malignant to some degree. Now, a lot of things in modern culture reinforce and even reward this notion of special status, uh, help to inflate people's sense of self. And I have to say that popular psychology books for a long time actually played a role in this too. It was hard to pick up a book in the 70s or 80s that wasn't all about fulfilling your own destiny, which is just fine, and was all about being the best person you could be, which is also just fine. But most of these books um, labored under the false assumption that self-esteem, which we'll talk about at length in a future program. I write about the difference between self-esteem and self-respect, the critical difference, and the critical difference in the making of these two concepts. So we'll talk about that in a future program. But these books have really touted the benefits of self-esteem and also uh, made the case, I think erroneously, for the fact that almost all human problems, almost all poor relationship choices that people made stemmed from deficiencies in self-esteem. And there was this kind of notion that you couldn't have too much of it and that you couldn't do enough to boost children's sense of their worth. And so there were a lot of messages given about the importance of feeling great about yourself. Now, I am not at all saying that there isn't something wrong with that, but we can regard ourselves too highly, and we can get messages that distort our ability to get the balance right when it comes to our sense of self-worth. That's one of the areas that we'll be exploring in great depth in one of the future programs, and it's also one of those 10 commandments of character that I referred to on previous programs, and that is the subject of my upcoming book, getting the balance right with respect to your sense of self. Too low an opinion of yourself is without question uh, bad for you. It can lead to all kinds of unwise decisions, especially in relationships, and it can impair your ability to be the best that you can be. But an inflated sense of self is not good either. And you can have too much self esteem. And you can prize yourself for the wrong things too. So, we're going to be doing a lot of talking about that and how that affects this dimension of narcissism that is the plague of our time and that factors into so many character disturbances, and how ego inflation can really contribute to the malignancy that narcissism can be, destroying relationships, wreaking havoc uh, with just about every human enterprise. So we'll talk more in depth about that, but I just want to make the case, or I just want to lay out for you the importance of getting it right when it comes to our sense of self. And there are too many aspects of modern culture that reinforce this notion that not only can't you think too highly of yourself, but also this notion that started way back in the pop psychology days, where there was a self help book on every shelf of every kind you could imagine. This misguided notion that whenever you see people acting in a haughty or pretentious or pompous manner, that it was always a compensation for underlying feelings of insecurity. And therefore, what the person really needed who was acting all that was affirmation and adulation. And this misguided notion, unfortunately, contributed to an awful lot of narcissistic malignancy. Now, it is true that some individuals who act in these seemingly grandiose ways are really covering for inner feelings of insecurity and low self worth. And they are covering for that unconsciously. They have long repressed their feelings of insecurity, and they are doing their best to present a very convincing, charming, and uh, sometimes even confident facade. But these days, that's not safe to assume. The fact is, there are too many folks, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that they've been reinforced by modern culture a whole lot. There are too many folks these days who think way too much of themselves, who take themselves way too seriously, who consider themselves special, and who therefore see themselves as not only superior, but entitled to do things that others wouldn't dream of doing. Now, there's one more dimension of character dysfunction that really plays a significant role in the most pathological and most malignant forms of narcissism, and that's the absence of conscience, a well developed conscience. But that also has its roots. That has its roots in empathy deficits and an unhealthy sense of self, a sense of grandiosity, a lack of respect for a higher power or a higher entity, a lack of awareness or care about the bigger picture. Now, in a subsequent program, we're going to be talking about the most severe forms of malignant narcissism, namely psychopathy and sociopathy. And yes, there is a difference. And yes, the terms have been uh, confusing for a lot of folks and for a long time, and primarily because even professionals have misused and confused the terms and their original meanings, and for quite some time. So it's natural that there would be a lot of confusion about these terms. But in upcoming episodes, we'll be spending some time with psychopathy and sociopathy and antisociality, too. That's another term that has been inappropriately used but has meaning. We'll be talking about those things in some upcoming programs. But a big factor in all these pathologies, all these more severe uh, character disturbances and more malignant forms of narcissism is a severe empathy deficit. So we're going to be talking about uh, how that happens, how it happens that uh, someone is deficient in their empathy capacity, what factors are at work there, and how these factors can become so extreme as to play the crucial role in these most severe character disturbances. But suffice it to say that empathy is a capacity that most human beings have. But studies are showing that some folks are innately impaired in their ability to care. They understand at an intellectual level what somebody else might be feeling or experiencing, but they can't appreciate at an emotional level or identify at an emotional level with the feeling. And they also can't let that feeling affect them or play a significant role in modifying or influencing their behavior. And many studies have been done showing that the brains of some folks actually work very, very differently. The brains of psychopaths, for example, true psychopaths, the brains of these folks work incredibly differently from normal brains. Now, we do not know enough yet to assert, as some people are already asserting without foundation, that necessarily the brains of these individuals are wired, so to speak, differently from birth. We don't know that yet. But we do know that somehow, some way, um, and for some reasons, as yet not fully understood, some folks, the way their brain operates, just can't feel the way most of us feel and don't have their behavior influenced by our capacity, by the normal human capacity to feel. So we know that much. And we know that uh, many things can influence how empathy develops in a normal human being when the capacity is there from the beginning. Um, Evidence is pointing to the fact that some folks are lacking in empathy capacity right from the very beginning. In other words, they just can't feel, never could feel for other human beings. But most of us have at least some capacity, but even with that capacity, it has to be nurtured. It has to be developed. I tell in workshops many times, I've shared in workshops uh, examples of young children's behaviors that I have seen. Callous, selfish, completely self-serving, seemingly heartless behaviors that in no way signify future sociopathy or psychopathy, but are just evidence of the child's lack of nurturing of their innate empathy capacity. It hasn't been uh, reinforced, developed, coached along. For example, I've seen young children uh, snatch a toy that they wanted from another young child, uh, maybe pushing that child down or tripping that child to take something out of the hands, or in other way, seemingly callously injuring the person that they uh, had some sort of beef with. Um, and doing so seemingly unregretfully without shedding a tear. As a matter of fact, maybe even with a smirk on their face. And does that necessarily mean that the child is a budding psychopath or sociopath or is destined to be a future such person? No, not necessarily. But our capacity for empathy, if the capacity is there to a normal degree, still has to be nurtured. Uh, it has to be nurtured in the home by parents or caretakers who uh, model the behavior, reinforce it when it occurs, and it also has to be encouraged in the child's social environment, at school, in their social circles, by their extended families. So the bottom line here is that empathy has to be nurtured, the capacity to feel it and the willingness to allow that empathy to influence or impact your behavior. It's one thing to be able to feel, it is another thing to act in a manner that might be even self sacrificing because you do feel. These are behaviors that have to be coached, nurtured, and heavily reinforced by one's environment for a person to grow healthily in character. Now, some folks are naturally gifted with a high capacity for empathy. They don't require as much coaching, they don't require as much reinforcement. Some folks have the capacity, but not that much of a capacity. And that capacity has to be nurtured much more ardently. And then, of course, there are those folks who are, for some reason, simply lacking in the capacity. But in any case, empathy has to be nurtured. And when it is not present, and especially when it doesn't influence behavior, all kinds of horrible things are possible within a relationship, within any relationship, whether it's a working relationship, a relationship that somebody even has with their job, especially a relationship that somebody might have with a relationship partner. So that's one of the two factors that influences how malignant or how potentially damaging, maladaptive, destructive uh, someone's narcissism is. The other factor has to do with self image, one's sense of self. And in narcissism, what we see most of the time is some ego inflation. Now, sometimes what appears is a haughty or pompous sense of self. Sometimes, this is the important thing to remember. Sometimes this is an indication of underlying insecurity, uh, low self-esteem, that a relatively more benign narcissist or a neurotic type of narcissist unconsciously compensates for with a facade of of pomposity or haughtiness. But these days, that is a dangerous, dangerous assumption to make because there are far more individuals, as I describe in my books, and you can read all about them in all 4 books. Character Disturbance, The Phenomenon of Our Age, In Sheep's Clothing, The Judas Syndrome, and How Did We End Up Here? All 4 books speak to this. And you can read hundreds of articles on my blog at drgeorgesimon.com about this as well. These days, most of the folks that show this kind of ego inflation, this inflated sense of self, most of the time these days, these folks act all that because they sincerely believe they're all that, and they're not compensating for anything. They're not unconsciously putting on a facade that masks inner insecurity and a low self-esteem or an impoverished sense of self. There are some folks who really sincerely believe they're special, that they're superior. And that sense of superiority or special status can get so extreme that the person feels, therefore, entitled to prey upon those they perceive to be of lesser status, those they perceive to be weak or inferior, inherently inferior. So this is the pathology that is malignant narcissism. It's rooted in these 2 things. This inflated sense of self, this non-compensatory grandiosity, and heartlessness, a lack of capacity for empathy. And depending on how present and intense these 2 factors are, depending on how much of these 2 factors is present, will determine how malignantly narcissistic a person is and how prone they are to using and abusing others in a wanton fashion, where they unabashedly, unashamedly, and with great joy sometimes, we'll talk about that in a future program, prey upon others, use and abuse others, exploit others, take advantage of others without any sense of real regret or remorse. And on a future program, we'll talk about the difference between regret, remorse, and contrition. We'll talk about that. That's an important thing too. But there's so many things to talk about. That's why we're back with Character Matters. There's so much to talk about. And I hope that folks will write me with their questions. You can go to my blog at manipulative-people.com or drgeorgesimon.com. That's drgeorgesimon.com. Go to the contact page and use the Contact Dr. Simon feature and ask your questions, and we'll address them on the program. And I'll have an announcement soon also about the upcoming live stream where you can tune in live to the podcast. It'll be put up in recorded form afterward on the channel here. But you'll be able to call in live with your questions once we have a date fixed for the first live program where we can take calls in real time. So we'll be continuing our discussion on narcissism over the next couple of episodes. I hope you'll tune in. I thank you for tuning in this time. And we'll be gradually moving toward a discussion of the most severe forms of narcissism, the most severe forms of character disturbance, especially psychopathy and sociopathy. So once again, thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. George Simon. See you next time on the new Character Matters.